1937. Amidst the 19th century splendor, a new governor arrives in Hanoi to take charge of France's colony of Indochina. Indochina had less than 3 years of peace remaining before plunging into an era of war that would last until 1975, giving this small, remote country a central place in world history. In 1940, the Japanese invaded Indochina, taking advantage of the defeat far away in Europe of France by Germany. Bereft of support from France, the French troops were in no position to resist the attacks from powerful, aggressive Japanese armies supported by Air Force and Navy. The French armies were outnumbered and outgunned, the soldiers often themselves from France's other colonies. Indochina was under the control of the Vichy French regime and surrendered, collaborating with the invaders, effectively running the colony for its new masters. Japan desired the wealth of Indochina, rubber, coal, rice, and corn, to power its war machine. Japan wanted the use of Indochina as a base for its war of expansion towards China to the north, in addition to the south and west with Indochina as a base for attacks on Burma, India, Australia, and the rest of the Pacific. Japan wanted to drive the European colonial powers out of the region, its backyard. Dressing this policy in the guise of a campaign of liberation from imperialism, Indochina, like most Japanese-occupied territories, became a member of the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Co-Prosperity Sphere rapidly revealed itself in truth to be a ruthless Japanese empire, which stripped Indochina of its agricultural and industrial wealth. As a result of Japanese policy, 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation. The first American bombers appeared in the skies of Vietnam in the 1940s as attacks were made on the Japanese. The American forces had an ally in this fight, to which American aircraft dropped supplies and arms. This was the National Committee for the Independence of Vietnam, the Viet Minh, who fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese. In 1945, as Japanese officers were arrested for war crimes against the Vietnamese people, Indochina presented an unstable and dangerous position. The north of Vietnam was to be occupied by nationalist Chinese troops, but the Japanese had already been disarmed by the Viet Minh and replaced by a Viet Minh Communist provisional government in Hanoi under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The country was divided, with British forces taking charge in the south, based at Saigon, a temporary division that was to become permanent and later a cause for war. In the south, the British were so stretched, the French too weak to act, that the former occupying Japanese soldiers were rearmed and used by the British as police. In the streets of Saigon, the British faced Viet Minh banners presenting the seething politics and the demand for a united and independent country. The French saw the re-establishment of their rule in Indochina as right and necessary, and began moves to regain control. As France regained strength, troops began to re-enter the country in ever-increasing numbers. France had declared Indochina a free state in the French Union, free to control its internal affairs, but with France able to decide foreign and economic affairs and able to station troops. The Viet Minh had accepted this in order to get rid of the Chinese. But in fact, the French had no intention of letting go, and as their numbers increased, so did tensions between the French and the Viet Minh. As the French marched through the streets of Hanoi, their forces presented an image of discipline and strength. However, the pride of the soldiers masked the stubbornness and unwillingness to perceive the truth of France's post-war position in the world. These forces were too strong not to be used, but not strong enough to overwhelm the Viet Minh, not strong enough to deter the Viet Minh, not strong enough to force and win any decisive battle. The blunt truth was that France, recovering from World War II, was neither rich enough nor strong enough to play the role of imperial mistress. What motivated France? Why was regaining control so important? French leader de Gaulle was a fervent patriot who simply believed in the greatness of France. Throughout the war in Europe, he had refused to be treated as anything other than the leader of a great power. De Gaulle's attitude was not unique. Many French wanted to return to normality, and the idea of normality was France as the mistress of a worldwide empire. Indochina was called the jewel in the crown of the French Empire, a rich province with great resources, worth having for more rewarding reasons than simply seeing a patch of the map shaded blue. The French and the Viet Minh became involved in a series of confrontations which resulted in late 1946 in the outbreak of an open war, with the government of Ho Chi Minh fleeing into hiding. The French aim was to end the war quickly. They employed textbook classic moves, a version of the Blitzkrieg, which had torn across the countryside of Europe. Air bombardment supported powerful thrusts and pincer movements by armored columns with parachute drops behind enemy lines. In the Europe of 1940, these tactics had brought the encirclement and surrender of vast armies. In the landscape of Vietnam, the enemy forces melted away and slipped through the grip of the armored pincers. The Indochina War was to be called La Guerre Sans Front, a war with no set positions, with no front line. The Viet Minh called 1947 the year of strategic defense. They avoided attacking the French force. Viet Minh attacks were confined to guerrilla activity. During this time, a network of spies and political activists filled the villages and countryside. The Viet Minh, in building up their strength, indoctrinated, educated, and trained. The French could not be certain whether any Vietnamese was friend or enemy. Bao Dai, the hereditary emperor of Vietnam, was persuaded to resume his throne by the French as they sought to create a political structure that justified their rule, turning history into reverse. Bao Dai was to be head of state in a puppet government of a supposedly independent country under French protection. Bao was a reluctant leader who preferred to live a life of luxury in the south of France, and his reign was punctuated by frequent exiles in Europe. In the first years of the war, in 1947 and 1948, in the classic French military tradition of Napoleon, the French mounted strong, aggressive invasions of the country strongholds of the Viet Minh. Throughout the next 7 years of the war, the French were always to seek this set-piece decisive battle. The French had strong motives to end the war swiftly. There was constant political pressure in Paris for cuts in military expenditure. French communists opposed the war, and rebellion was brewing in other parts of the French Empire. The French sought to destroy the Viet Minh leadership, the main headquarters, their strongest divisions. To attack in this way, victory, if it came, would be decisive. The victories won in these early offensives seemed crushing. In this period, the first phase, 9,000 Viet Minh were claimed killed, and a vast region of the country was said to be cleared of communist control, the network of subversion destroyed. The victory that surrounded the French amidst the smoke and ruins was an illusion. The Viet Minh, knowing that they had not the strength at this time to defeat the French, had withdrawn rather than face battle. As the French congratulated each other on the success and returned to barracks and base, the Viet Minh simply crept back to resume their control. The French, though they had cleared vast areas of the country, had established a range of forts in the north to protect the supposedly cleared areas from further infiltration across the Chinese border. Those forts, those lonely garrisons, were now dangerously exposed and surrounded within enemy territory. In 1949, Mao Zedong won power in China, his communist forces overcoming national Chinese forces. National Chinese refugees fleeing the new communist government escaped by raft and boat to Vietnam. Now, in communist China, the Viet Minh had a safe area in which to train and regroup, a safe route for supplies, and a big, powerful ally who would be a source of weapons and material. When, in 1950, the Viet Minh went onto the offensive, it was against the isolated northern forts along the Chinese borders, each the guardian of a strategic gateway from China, that their wrath was brought to bear. Remote from French air power, these forts lay in dense forest, without airstrips, without the later invention of helicopter. Reinforcements had to be by parachute drop or by ground convoys, which had to thread their way up along winding mountain roads. Roads that made ambush easy. Dense forest grew to the very edge of the tracks. The conditions of the road meant travel was slow, escape difficult. The forts fell, one by one. The loss of over 6,000 troops and the collapse of the North did massive political damage to the French war effort and were devastating for French strategy. The Chinese border was now completely open. There was no opposition to the flow of support. The strategic options open to the Viet Minh were now wider. They could now open attacks to the west, and they could make ever stronger offensives. With their own lifeline secure, the Viet Minh stepped up their attacks on the Red River Delta, a network of river courses to the south and east of Hanoi. The Delta was a key square in the strategic chessboard of the war. The Delta isolated the capital from the sea, from where all French supplies came. The Delta was in Viet Minh control, and the French engaged in a combat to keep their lifeline open. Throughout the war, the Delta was to be the scene of constant violence, sometimes of a major offensive, always of infiltration and terrorist attack. In 1951, the French armies were drawn into an attack in the Delta against the Viet Minh. The enemy, as usual, melted away. The French secured an apparent victory and pursued the retreating Viet Minh to secure their triumph. And then, suddenly, were attacked by a heavy Viet Minh assault. On this occasion, the French were strong enough. Heavy bombardment by land and air was brought to bear with 6,000 communists dead. Both sides could and should have been able to draw lessons from these first major engagements. The war would be won or lost by the side that could best live in and with the landscape. The French, for all their material strength, was immobile, tied to roads, obsessed with strong points and forts, failings and weaknesses which the Viet Minh were to exploit. The first phase of the war, while fighting was bitter, both sides were building up their strength. As the communists indoctrinated the population and trained in China, so too the French gathered their forces. As it was becoming clear that the war was a battle in the Cold War against communism, huge deliveries of heavy, sophisticated American weaponry became available. Ships disgorged arsenals of industrial military might. Convoys of weapons threaded their way through the countryside. The build-up of strength made the French once more go in search of a decisive, crushing victory to end the war once and for all. The French particularly saw air power as a key to winning the war. It broke the French forces free of the land. The Viet Minh had no air force and no air defense. Low-level attacks were made by the fighter bombers, high-level attacks by heavy bombers. The success in defending against the Viet Minh offensives in late 1950 led the French to plan an offensive of their own in the Red River Delta, to preempt, to strike first, in a positive way. In the spring of 1951, the French, with their strength built up to a highest level yet, attacked the Viet Minh in the Delta. Once again, it was a massive offensive with paratroopers, tanks, and heavy artillery. For once, the Viet Minh were taken by surprise. The fighting was savage, with villages blown to pieces, fought over, captured, lost, and recaptured. For every action that involved the use of heavy weaponry from afar, there were savage hand-to-hand actions and close firefights. In one tragic action, French General de Lattre was forced to order a unit commanded by his only son to fight to the death. The operations in the Delta were a big defeat for the Viet Minh. At last, brought to battle, the communists were forced to make counterattacks. Their only defense, the use of mass human waves, attempting to swamp their enemy by sheer weight of numbers. Simple tactics used against aircraft with napalm, against entrenched machine gun positions, caused heavy communist casualties. The result was a massive number of Viet Minh dead and mass surrenders producing vast columns of prisoners. The battles were victories for the French, not conclusive, decisive, but victories all the same, and they restored confidence and morale. The Viet Minh, although tactically defeated, still held the strategic initiative, and though frustrated in the Delta, they were able to mount attacks in the forested highlands to the north and west of Hanoi. The French barely had time to assess their Delta victory before pressure began again with assaults on forts and isolated garrisons. Attacks against which the French were forced to deploy their last reserves, with parachute drops, to desperately reinforce their garrisons. Parachute forces played a central role in French operations before the widespread use of the helicopter. The parachute attack was the only way to be air mobile. The paratrooper was a vulnerable soldier easily out of supplies and dependent on having a safe area to land. The mass paratroop attack is something that has passed into history. In spite of both sides placing such great effort into the area of the Delta, the war was destined to be resolved amid the remote northwestern mountain forests. It was here that both sides were to believe the war could be brought to an end. At the same time as these dramatic and desperate battles was a war of continuous low-level operation, of what would later come to be called search and destroy operations. French forces would search the countryside to uncover the Viet Minh, arresting activists and would-be terrorists. The French Navy created a fleet in miniature of small craft that operated within the many narrow and shallow watercourses of the country. This was a war without fronts, a war where the enemy wore no uniforms and was in front, behind, and all around. The French could not tell friend from enemy in this sea of population. That ordinary Vietnamese were alienated in these operations was a crucial factor in determining the loyalty of the population. Throughout the countryside, the war was also a political war for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. Viet Minh infiltration had meant that the French state was at a disadvantage in this battleground. French forces propagandized, provided practical support with medical care for the population. Yet they were still the outsider, those who would leave at the end of the day when the Viet Minh could return. In 1951, French commanders knew that they had bought time with their successes in the Red River Delta. The Viet Minh would need time to regroup, perhaps devise new tactics to overcome French material superiority. French forces had been demoralized. Now it was believed that the Viet Minh could be defeated, and this encouraged the French to plan a new attack. The French decided to seize the strategic initiative to carry the war to the Viet Minh. In March 1951, the French attacked with paratroopers and seized the city of Hoa Binh. Hoa Binh was in the northwest, a crossroads by which supplies from China reached the west and south of the country. The French believed that a garrison could dominate the area and cut the communist supply lines. The French intended that Hoa Binh would be the bait in a trap for the communists which the Viet Minh could not resist to attack. The campaign was named Operation Meat Grinder. The intention was to orchestrate a battle in which the Viet Minh would be bled white and destroy their strength. Once occupied, the French massively reinforced their paratroopers with heavy weapons and tanks. They constructed line after line of fortifications with trenches and machine guns. There were other pressing political reasons for the French to seek action and a crushing triumph. In Paris, the French National Assembly was voting on funds for the war, a victory would secure the political and financial support the soldiers needed. The American Congress was debating aid to Vietnam. These soldiers fought to secure votes in France and America. The assault on Hoa Binh was massive, using paratroopers, a ground column, and attacks up the Black River by the French Navy. The French, in fact, threw a powerful punch which wafted into empty air. the Viet Minh withdrew, an action that created an illusion of success and drew in more French forces. To the Viet Minh, Hoa Binh was an opportunity to surround a large number of their enemy, bring concentrated strength to bear, and bring about a massive defeat of the French. All the spare communist forces were ordered to the battle. As so often in war, the events overtook the plans of the generals. Commanders on both sides had imagined that the battle would be for the city itself. In fact, the real killing grounds were to become the supply lines, Route 6, the highway from Hanoi and the Black River. All supplies by road and river had to run the gauntlet of a constant Viet Minh attack. The road was overlooked by hills and cliffs that the Viet Minh used to shell and ambush. As was the Black River, where the French Navy operated a small force of boats and landing craft. The Navy fought a series of battles against mines, artillery, and snipers, even Viet Minh frogmen, as it sent riverborne supplies. Sensing that a victory would be a dramatic turning point in the war, the Viet Minh threw resources recklessly against the heavily defended positions. Mass human waves attacked, squandering lives. In scenes reminiscent of 1916, the Viet Minh charged the dug-in French troops in dense formation, seeking victory by weight of number. The bodies of the Viet Minh soldiers carpeted the barbed wire of the French lines. Viet Minh troops would swarm over French tanks in vast numbers, dying crushed beneath treads, blown to pieces by tank cannon at point-blank range. Dying until the numbers told, and the armored vehicles were covered in bodies, grenades thrown down the muzzles of cannons. The battles were bloody seesaw affairs, where ground was yielded and regained by the day and by the hour. Outposts built to protect the supply lines all along the river and the road were repeatedly overrun and destroyed, the Viet Minh retreating before counterattacks on the fort only to return and renew the battle at their initiative. French infantry were repeatedly ordered out into sorties and patrols to engage the enemy in a series of vicious confrontations. The Viet Minh marshaled artillery onto the high ground above Hoa Binh and began to bring the airstrip under shell fire, the wounded having to stay in what became known as the Hell of Hoa Binh. The battle for Hoa Binh began to extend the entire length of Route 6. Columns of relief sent from the capital became bogged down in fighting, in struggles of life and death of their own. The 25 miles of road came to be described as one vast calvary for the French army, as meter by meter was fought over, drawing in more and more forces. Hoa Binh had become a hemorrhage of French strength. With ghastly irony, Operation Meat Grinder began to run in reverse as more and more of France's forces were drawn into the battle. In early 1952, Hoa Binh was evacuated. The French retreat along the road and river was a final bloody act of Operation Meat Grinder, the forces fighting a desperate rearguard action against pursuing Viet Minh all the way. Hoa Binh was an attempt by both sides to win a decisive victory. The knockout blow both thought possible descended into a bloodletting of attrition. The lessons were there for both communist and French. Only the communist profited. The fighting in Hoa Binh drew in the elite of the French forces, the most mobile units. This only increased the French disadvantage elsewhere. Having engaged the French in the northwest, the Viet Minh, like a nimble lightweight dancing round a heavy, more powerful but ultimately slower opponent, switched their attacks to the Red River Delta. Through 1952, a constant series of small level actions drained resources, attacking airstrips, burning villages. The incessant fighting, the continuous losses created the feel of a war that would go on and on forever. A war itself, already 5 years old, added on to the suffering and struggle of World War II, a continuous river of death, loss, and suffering. This fighting was often called mopping up operations, a mopping up of a flow that seemed always renewed. By late 1952, as the fighting continued with a low level of incessant skirmish, the Viet Minh were considering their actions in the next phase of the war. It was determined that the way to bring about the defeat of the French lay in the wooded hills of the Northwest. The Communist strategic focus moved firmly into the wooded hills, further inland, further on from Hoa Binh. In November of 1952, in response to growing Viet Minh activity, French attacks were made to the northwest with paratroopers and air support. Operation Lorraine was once more an attempt by the French to cut Viet Minh supply lines. In a constant stream of fighting, French forces were dragged into a greater and greater commitment into the northwest. Attacks were made upon the airstrip of Nha Sam, a provocation and a taunt to lure the French. Operation after operation became set amidst the tangled and folded landscape of dense forested hills, each set at a more impossible angle to the other. Each in areas, in places at the end of more and yet more kilometers of dangerous and difficult road. In scenes that were prescient of Vietnam's future, the distant forests and mountain areas came under attack by the heavy bombers of the French Air Force. Massive air bombardments were thrown against the Viet Minh supply lines, a network of slender yet tough routes deep in the remote countryside and wildernesses, by planes and tactics designed to rip the heart out of industrial cities. Delivered from high altitude, massive explosions tore through the jungle trails and pathways, through which flowed the lifeblood of the communist war effort. This massive delivery of expensive ordnance was flung almost at random against guesses and hunches. Too often the French were aiming mighty blows at thin air. The French army did not lose the war because it was a bad army. The French army was a European army equipped to fight a European war against a European enemy, an enemy which was its own mirror image. Communist leader Ho Chi Minh was to boast he never lost one tank in the fight against the French because he had no tanks. The Western industrialized armies that fought and won wars like that fought in Indochina used weapons and tactics that were suited to the landscape, not simply the physical terrain, but the political landscape of the hearts and minds of the population. It required an army that would not roam the countryside in powerful mechanized vehicles, but an army that would become close to the land and people, fighting as did their enemy. By late 1952, the leaders of the Viet Minh had learnt of French tactics and of French strategy. As 1952 turned to 1953, the Viet Minh knew what the French response would be to their moves. The strategy slowly evolved, with each action, by each action, drawing the French towards their eventual disaster in the far northwest of the country. strategies that were to draw the French forces far away from their supply lines. Tactics that would negate the massive air power, the bombing that had taken so many Viet Minh lives. Strategies that would make the French provide an easy and vulnerable target. In the spring of 1953, the Viet Minh strategy began to unfold. The Viet Minh widened the war with attacks against the neighboring country of Laos. To many Laotian peasants, the Communists, as they did in Vietnam, seemed to offer the only viable alternative to colonial rule. Strategically, the attacks posed the French even more problems. The war, which already stretched France's soldiers, was now even larger. The war without fronts had yet another front. The Viet Minh, as usual, withdrew against French counterattacks, but left the French with a new, larger area to garrison and supply. On the 20th of March 1953, the French occupied a town in northwestern Vietnam. A strategic crossroads, again a garrison, a fort that could cut the communist supply lines to the south and west. A town on the very edge of Vietnam. That town was Dien Bien Phu. The French war was to play out its final scenes at Dien Bien Phu. The script for the peace was already being drafted in Geneva. In scenes of classic diplomacy, a conference of the great powers gathered. Russia, America, China, Britain, and France met with the Viet Minh to resolve the future of Vietnam. Incredibly, in occupying Dien Bien Phu, the French were pursuing the same dream that had turned to nightmare at Hoa Binh. Dien Bien Phu was to be a super fort, bait to attract the Viet Minh into an attack that would turn into a decisive victory for the French. Dien Bien Phu was in a valley, a complex of forts with 2 airstrips extending over a large area. Massive fortifications were constructed. To the Viet Minh, Dien Bien Phu was both threat and opportunity. If the French won, they could carry the war right into the Viet Minh heartland. If destroyed, the fall of Dien Bien Phu could end the war, destroying French will to continue, destroying American will to support. The total French garrison was 12 battalions, plus many heavy guns and tanks with permanent air cover. There was high morale and an air of impregnability. The French confidence was vastly misplaced. When the Viet Minh assault burst upon the forts, the defenders were barely aware that in the wooded hills overlooking their stronghold, the Viet Minh had assembled a massive force. The torrent of fire came from 40,000 communists gathered all about the French. Perhaps 250,000 porters had carried supplies by hand through jungle paths to support these soldiers. The greatest shock thrust upon the French came from Viet Minh artillery. The French guns had been flown in by air. The Viet Minh had dismantled their guns and carried each piece by hand to its position in the high ground overlooking Dien Bien Phu, a feat of labor thought impossible. Firing from hidden secret positions, hidden from the air, hidden from the valley floor, the French knew nothing until the guns spoke. The French did not know they were outnumbered and outgunned. It was on the 10th of March that the Viet Minh had opened fire. The first target for the hidden artillery was the 2 landing strips. If they could be denied the French, then the siege would become truly classically medieval. The French starved to submission. The French guns attempted to reply, but the Viet Minh guns were too deeply dug in, too cunningly hidden to be hurt. French airstrikes equally failed. As the artillery barrage continued, the Viet Minh sent squads of death volunteers up and over the barbed wire of the forts. After just 3 days, the first fort of Dien Bien Phu fell. Both airstrips were closed, and air supplies for the rest of the battle had to be parachuted in. In old-fashioned siege technique, at night the Viet Minh dug trenches towards the French lines. Each night the French could hear them, digging ever closer. No quarter was given. It was impossible to evacuate the wounded, and the Viet Minh ruthlessly shelled transport aircraft marked with a red cross. Chinese anti-aircraft guns were positioned such that French air superiority was lost. The Viet Minh lost 10,000 in the first month. Even amongst their tough soldiers there were murmurings of resistance. The French parachuted yet more reinforcements. By the middle of April, 50,000 communists surrounded the 16,000 French, and even more guns were brought through the jungle. Heavy cloud negated air power and brought the communist trenches ever closer. Viet Minh soldiers would rise out of the ground meters from the French lines. While French appeals to the USA for heavy bombers and attack aircraft carriers were refused, the Americans even suggested the use of nuclear weapons, a plan rejected after British objections. On May 7th, the end came after a week of ferocious attacks, the French fighting almost to the final bullet. Some 7,000 of the very best of the French army were killed. 8,000 were to be taken into captivity. The Viet Minh, placing a low value on the life of the individual soldier, perhaps lost at least 18,000 men, with many more wounded. Was the French move to fight at Dien Bien Phu an act of madness, an act doomed to failure? The strategy was sound. It was in French tactical imagination and vision that lay the seeds of defeat. The French were unable to imagine, to conceive, that such a concentration of communist strength could be brought to bear. Dien Bien Phu was crushing to French will, shaking French society to its roots. Demonstrations and riots in protest at the conduct of the war, at the defeat, spread across the streets of Paris. Politicians blamed for the defeat were mobbed. There were calls for de Gaulle to return to power. The battle was more than a military defeat, a surrender of troops. It was a surrender of the will to continue by the French government. The war was to be brought rapidly to an end. The defeat was one more gust in the wind of change that was shattering the whole structure of the European great powers as their empires broke up. The war was not over. There was still more fighting and dying to be done. With morale shattered and reeling from the shock of the defeat in the West, the whole Red River Delta degenerated into a continuous melee as 80,000 Viet Minh troops engaged with the French. The peace settlement could not come too soon to end the agony. With the defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Conference rapidly drew to conclusion, and an agreement was signed. The French were to abandon their colony. All French troops were to be withdrawn. Ho Chi Minh's government was recognized. Prisoners were to be released. The country was to be divided at the 17th parallel of latitude, a ruler straight line drawn on the map dividing a northern communist state led by Ho Chi Minh with a southern state based on Saigon. All through the bloody war, the South had remained comparatively peaceful, relatively free of violence, the communists contained. There was to be a period of free exchange of the population when the Vietnamese could choose which state they wished to join. The Americans wanted the southern state to help them contain communism. To Viet Minh astonishment, the Chinese supported them, wanting to keep Vietnam weak, divided, and dependent. The Geneva Agreement promised elections across the whole of Vietnam in 1956, which would unite the country. History teaches us that wars must end cleanly and finally. A peace settlement that leaves questions unanswered, that leaves business unfinished, leaves the door open to further wars. Despite the massive triumph of the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu, the Peace of Geneva left many issues open. Hanoi was split with feverish communist-inspired demonstrations against partition. The communists were not to be satisfied by the partition, by the creation of a rival state in the South with American backing. It is in this anger that lay the seeds of the future conflict. The spring saw the return of the captured Viet Minh and the reciprocal exchange of French prisoners. The well-fed faces of the Viet Minh were in vivid contrast to the pitiful and sad state of the French soldiers, some returning as walking skeletons after the harshest of detentions by the communists. Half those captured in the last battle had died in captivity. The refugees that flooded into Hanoi were the first of a vast number of displaced people for whom the war put them in the wrong place, who were to have no future in the new Vietnam. There was a period of 90 days after the signing of the Geneva Peace Accord when there was to be free movement of refugees between the territories of North and South Vietnam. During this time, 900,000 left the North. Many were Catholics, fearing persecution. The usual trail of human misery of families clutching at the scraps of their former lives went on its way, using any means they could to escape the communist state. The only people to come north were the Viet Minh guerrillas and activists who were recalled from the south. As the balance of the population flowed away from the communist north, the Viet Minh made attempts to prevent the exodus. Slowly, the French forces left. The faces of the soldiers reflecting joy and relief, balanced with shame, a failure of a proud European power, an image of national defeat and humiliation, and an ungraceful retreat from empire. This was an army and a nation that still did not understand why they should lose to an army and a nation of peasants. The soldiers' parade was a last parade of a lost era of the past. As the proud ranks of the Viet Minh marched in, the future, the destiny they brought with them was that of a communist state. In eerie echoes of the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, there were bloody attacks on the countryside and farms. Perhaps 100,000 of what the communists called the landlord classes were liquidated as agriculture was forcibly collectivized. The communist ideology that marched alongside the soldiers was one of perpetual struggle. In the South, the refugees, another long line in the succession of boat people, struggled to an uncertain future. The state to which they came was founded only on the basis of not being communist, as a place where those who feared and had nothing to gain in the new order would go. Already amongst the poor, the homeless, the dispossessed and fearful, the Viet Minh were infiltrating communist activists who would seek to subvert the southern state. As the deadline for partition and the closing of the borders approached, when North Vietnam would become another sealed state that would keep its citizens in, the rush to flee the new order reached panic as the people became desperate to escape the future. Communist Vietnam became a state on the Stalinist model, where perpetual struggle, a perpetual fight against outsiders, the fight for further revolution was used to override and outweigh any other aim or aspiration that the people might have, and to justify any terms of harsh, austere rule. The last French left on October 9, 1954, leaving in good order, marching with discipline, passing into the history books and into the past. Of the history of Vietnam, much remained to be written. In the southern state, the communists fought a campaign of protest and political agitation against the partition of the country, demanding reunification. The protests could turn into violent acts where symbols of Western imperialism and domination of the country were attacked. A sad failing of the Geneva Settlement was that the protests tearing up the streets of the South could and did have a real basis in grievances. The agreement built South Vietnam as a state with inherent weaknesses and deep faults, a state that lacked the secure democratic foundations, the strength, the institutions of a democratic state. The South lacked the democratic basis of strength that would enable it to stem the communist stream of subversion and terrorism. The political weaknesses of South Vietnam were compensated by a transfer of physical, material, military strength. The soldiers of South Vietnam were given the weapons, the uniforms, and the skills of a Western industrialized army, taught to use the very same tactics and weapons that had so recently brought the forces of the French to disaster. The communist view of the world was one of continuous struggle, a strategy of continuous restless turmoil and fighting for revolution. No sooner was the settlement reached in Vietnam than fighting and agitation began in the Southeast Asian country of Laos. Already, talk of Western governments was of domino theories, a spread of communism as one country fell, causing the fall of another. In the attacks on Laos was seen the next step in a communist attempt to dominate the region. It was not paranoia. Communism was an ideology that sought to expand, and by fighting its external enemies, communism suppressed its own failings. The government of South Vietnam was handed to Ngo Dinh Diem, a strongman and anti-communist who was chosen to be a bastion against communism. Diem was supposedly the premier beneath the monarch Emperor Bao Dai, who once more emerged to play a walk-on part in his country's history. Diem sat at the center of a web of nepotism and corruption in which family connection and friendship were the strings of power. Diem's state was a police state. In a series of doubtful votes and transparently rigged elections, Diem deposed Bao Dai and assumed dictatorial power. The 1956 elections never happened. Diem was confident that his presence as an ally to fight communism was more important to the U.S. than any lip service to democracy. The southern state was further weakened by religious and cultural tensions. Diem came from a small, Catholic-educated elite which dominated the mostly Buddhist society. It was a society where the unelected held despotic power. Diem's egotistical sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, publicly goaded and taunted the non-Catholic majority. The tensions, inconsistencies, the weaknesses of South Vietnam meant that an eventual continuation of the war by the communists was inevitable. The peace settlement was just the interval in a longer tale. In the tragic story of French involvement, their doomed, quixotic, and folly-laden attempt to cling to their colony, to cling to a past rather than face reality in the future, the blueprint was laid out for the history that was to follow. The echoes of France's involvement in Indochina resound to this day. With the end of the war, the muddied issue of whether the war was being fought for national independence of Vietnam or for communist revolution was resolved. The French left. The colonialist aspect of the war disappeared, and the war hardened, with American involvement focusing the war into a battlefield for the Cold War. The struggle to keep the colony cost France over 93,000 lives. Not just French deaths. The war cost the lives of Africans and of Arabs wearing the uniform of France. And many more Vietnamese, numbering in the many hundreds of thousands, died in this first Vietnam War. The victory of the Viet Minh over the French had a massive impact upon the movement for decolonization and the end to empires. After Dien Bien Phu, the armed might of the colonial powers were no longer regarded as invincible. The Europeans of the mid-20th century still clung to concepts of moral, cultural, and racial superiority over other peoples of the world. These were ideas that died at Dien Bien Phu and marched into history with the French. Those who fail to understand history are condemned to repeat that history. A central lesson of France's struggle in Indochina is that material superiority was not enough to ensure victory. The Viet Minh victory proved that war is in fact an extension of politics. The Viet Minh victory was based in political superiority over the French. To hold the political high ground is not the same as holding the moral high ground. The Viet Minh control of the Vietnamese countryside is not the same as having the support of the population. The Viet Minh had the strength to pay the high price of death and destruction. As the 1950s slid into the 1960s, as Ho Chi Minh courted his communist allies for support, as a new American president promised to pay any price to oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty, as American troops prepared to fulfill that promise in Vietnam, and the Viet Minh were renamed the Viet Cong. The lessons of the war were there for all to read, to provide the path to victory or defeat.